All right, so with that, good morning and good afternoon, I guess, for everybody. We're just coming to the end of Donor Experience Week Day 2, and it's been a ride. My name is Samantha Lego. If you don't know me, most of you probably have. I'm Keela's Marketing Director. We've got Mel in the background today fielding all of your tech questions, so feel free to say hi. Before we get started, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that here in Vancouver, we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I want to give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. And follow up that with another acknowledgement, both of our amazing speakers who have donated their time this week, as well as to our sponsors, Imagine Canada, Pano, and the Good Partnership. Donor Experience Week is all about creating inclusive and robust online experiences for your donors. With COVID-19 reshaping the face of giving, it's more important than ever to set up good online practices and good digital acquisition and stewardship strategies in order to meet donors where they are. And the reason you're able to do that is through the collection of donor data. And so with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today. Clay Buck is a 30-year fundraising veteran who's been both a frontline fundraiser at several nonprofits and a senior consultant with major national firms. He has held the Certified Fundraising Executive certification since 2010, served as the president of the Las Vegas chapter of AFP, is an AFP master trainer, and his session today is about data and how to both collect it and use it ethically. Well, this will be a very useful and topical session. I think what I'm most looking forward to is that it's Lego themed. As my name suggests, I'm very invested in this. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will get to them intermittently throughout the presentation, so be prepared for a lively discussion. As a reminder, you will be receiving the recording along with the slide deck at the end of the conference. So with that out of the way, I will pass it over to you, Clay.
Thank you. I am excited to be here and looking forward to this discussion. And quite honestly, a little, I gotta say, a little daunted isn't the right word. Like I'm following that session on gender inclusive data from Jude. I'm a little bit like, there's a lot of pressure to live up to that. So it was such a good session, and I am thrilled and excited by that and encouraged by that. So looking forward to digging into this, and thank you for the warm introduction and for including me in this. And again, we're talking about data and we're talking about ethics, and if there's anything that makes people's eyes roll or leave sessions, to be honest, it's those two topics. So we're gonna have fun with it. We're gonna enjoy this because I think that data should be fun, and it's an important discussion and one I'm kind of passionate about. So please do pipe into the chat box, pipe into the Q&A box, and ask questions as we go, because I'd much rather stop and spend time on a section and enjoy it and have fun with it and dig into it, then come back to it later when we all go, no, wait, what did we say again? So again, thanks for being here. I am thrilled and happy to be here. Here's what we're going to kind of talk about, just kind of a rough agenda. We're going to start with the connection economy and what we mean by that, and how that informs this discussion about data, and looking at data through an ethical lens and what ethics mean as we approach data. We're going to talk a little bit about privacy laws and the implications of those. Why don't I slow down? And data security, which ties to that discussion about the future of data, because honestly, in terms of how we approach data and what we're managing, I really think this is one of the most critical discussions in the sector facing us now, regardless of where we are or what vertical we're working in. So let's start with the connection economy. And I don't know that Seth Godin is the one that actually coined this phrase, but certainly when I hear the phrase, and he certainly talks about it a lot, as do many thought leaders in marketing, in business, in planning, in the conversations where we are now about talking about leaving the industrial economy and entering the connection economy, where the value of our business, and particularly for us in the nonprofit world and in the charity world and working with donors, really our focus needs to be and is far more reliant on those connections and how we relate and how relationships work than it used to be in terms of delivering product or delivering a service. Connection is driving us more. So what do we mean when we say and we talk about the connection economy? I found this great definition of it from payette.com. The connection economy rewards value created by building relationships and fostering connections rather than assets and stuff like the industrial economy did. The industrial economy values more, better, faster, whereas the connection economy builds on who you know, what you know, and how that how that knowledge influences your connections. And if any of us that have been in fundraising for a while will know or remember that we've been talking about this from day one. If you go back and look at the work that informs our sector and our work, and I tend to go back to Harold Seymour's seminal book, Designs for Fundraising, 1967. He was talking about this then, and he was building on the knowledge that came before him, that the value and strength of fundraising is about the relationship between the charity and the donor, and the fundraiser and the donor, all of that working together on behalf of and for the beneficiary. We're in a new world, and I'm very conscious that we're part of a discussion today that is driven by a phenomenal software platform, which helps us to build connections, right? And the implications of that and how we connect through new technology. It's easier than ever before, and yet the need to create that deeper relationship is even stronger than before. So in terms of building relationships and driving that connection in the connection economy, data is the most valued and coveted asset. So not only is it an asset for us in the organization, for us as fundraisers, for us as charities, we've also got to be very aware that as this reliance and attention on data grows, other people want it, which means people are going to try to get it because of the value of data and because of the value that it can bring. This is just a list of the top data, with the exception of one. This is a list of the top data scandals or data hacks of 2020. The one that I'm pointing out that was not part of 2020 is the famous one that really sort of lit up this conversation, which was Cambridge Analytica and the data hack and the data share that went through there. But all of these companies have had some sort of data hack or data problem, right, within the last 7-8 months. If you remember, right as at least in the United States, when lockdown really started, in its sort of patchwork way across the different states, Zoom, we are on a Zoom call right now. And Zoom in the very first stages had a very early hack, and that's what started all of us adding passwords and waiting rooms and things like that to keep the data more secure. We also are living in and working now at a time when we know that the nonprofit sector isn't safe, that one of our biggest providers has been hacked in a very large and very public way and has put donor data potentially at risk. So it brings an awareness to us that we are not in this sector immune from this. And indeed, it sort of raises, if it wasn't there before, it raises the focus that we need to bring on how we're bringing data privacy and data security into our work. By some estimates, cybercrime, data hacking, is expected to globally cost up to $6 trillion annually. Now, obviously, this is all sectors. This is business. This is, anywhere. This is not just the nonprofit sector. But looking at it in context of this scale, $6 trillion annually, losses of this scale put the incentives for innovation and investment at risk and will be more profitable than the global trade of all major illegal drugs combined. In other words, there is money to be made in hacking and selling private data because companies want it. And driving informed marketing and fundraising and communications decision is reliant on that data. So I don't, we start with a little bit of fear here, and it's really more to just inform that this is a real thing and this is important, and something that is probably a little past time for us in the charity sector to be paying attention to. So how does the fundraisers look then at data management? What is an approach that we can take in this sector on how we think about and how we work with our data? And the number one thing is, and you'll hear me say this 100 times, and if you know me for a minute, you're going to hear this phrase: donors are data. The donors that we have in our systems that we know, really to us, they are those data points. So building that trust with our audience base, with our donors and supporters, is the key first step of ensuring that they trust us in protecting the asset that they've given. Secondly, we need to take a legal and ethical approach to how we manage and how we approach data. And then thirdly, start taking steps now. We need to change the culture and start thinking about data as more of an asset and more a part of our whole work than this thing that is done over here that somebody takes care of. Now, again, I'm going to make an assumption that most of us are CRM and data people and have a responsibility for managing it. We have a responsibility to champion and stand up and be the leader, regardless of our position in the company, but to champion and stand up in our work and say, hey, we need to be paying close attention to this. As simple as, I'll talk about this several times, one just very simple thing that kind of needs to change and we need to stop doing is we need to stop emailing lists. Anytime we have a list with identifiable donor data, we need to stop emailing it. Side note, if you ever work with a consultant or a vendor who asks you to email your list, find a new vendor or consultant, because it is one of the most insecure ways to do it. But of course, some of our senior leaders find it easier to do that, just to email data across. Whatever role we are, we need to stand up and go, hey, we need to stop doing that. Data security, right? And all kind of own that leadership role in taking care of it. We need to be aware of the laws, and they are different everywhere we go. We also need to raise these to the levels of policy and procedures and bringing it to a governance level so that it's not just a culture change, but it is an actual physical change in how we manage and think about data internally in shifting our security of it, because the value of trust, transparency, and ethical relationship management is more critical than ever before. I panicked a little bit before I started realizing that some of this deck and this conversation is a little bit US centric. So forgive me for that and for not having equal numbers for Canada and the rest of the world, but I always found this survey to be quite telling. Right. So in this survey that was done and that the Chronicle of Philanthropy produced, right, 52% of Americans say they trust nonprofits. Flip that. That means almost half of Americans don't trust the nonprofit sector. And if we're creating any sort of lack of trust in our data management, right, that's just going to add to it. Timing is good because I'm about to go into another section and I do see some questions coming through. So I thought maybe we pause for a second and take a look at those.
Absolutely. So the first question is from Tamara. Are there any significant differences between Canadian and American charities regarding data laws? I think that you're going to get to that a little bit later, so we could pause on that one.
I am, and yes.
So the next one from Anna is, what do you mean by stop emailing lists? So maybe dive into that a little bit more.
Great question. Yeah. So and Samantha, I'm sorry, I should know the language that I don't. Some call it export, some call it extraction, whatever. You pull a list out of Keeler, out of whatever your CRM is, right? And your major gift officer or your CEO is about to go on a visit, and so you pull a list of names and addresses and phone numbers and gift amounts, and you email it. You send it as an attachment to that email. Both internally and even more importantly, sending an external email of including a list as an attachment is an easily hacked data breach. So rather than including like an Excel list or a list of CF, whatever the list format is, rather than emailing that as an attachment, we either need to get in the practice of going into our CRMs and managing lists in there, or if you have to pull it out of the system, saving it on a secure site, right, on your network where it can be accessed and is protected. Yeah.
To build onto this, I've got a question from Shayla. What about sharing a link to a list?
What about sharing a link to a list? Depends on where it is. If you're sharing a link to a list, and gosh, I mean, there's a depth to that question too, because we're all working remotely now. So we're all sharing more with things like Dropbox or OneDrive or Google Drive or any of those. As long as those are protected, right? And you know that there is a security place on those shared drives, and that's a conversation to have with your IT team. But sharing that link is not as secure, but it is more secure than emailing a list attachment. Again, if that email got hacked and somebody got that link and they could potentially get into it, but then they'd have to access your network. So probably more secure and a better approach, but also knowing, building that culture of, hey, when you ask for a list, I've put a folder here with your name on it, and that's where I've put it, and we all know where to go to get it. Or again, it's in the system itself. Yeah.
And Anna, as a follow-up, says, oh, I thought you meant stop sending emails to lists. Phew, that's a sentiment that we would all share, Anna, don't worry.
I mean, I am one of those that I'm sorry, all due respect to those who believe it, but inbox zero is a myth. And if you're an inbox zero person, more power to you. I just turned 50 a month ago, and I have given up on trying to stay on top of email and keep it clean. So I'm with you. Like, the less email I have, the better all around. Okay. Good questions. Thank you. So if we're talking, I'm sorry, were there more, Samantha, or should we?
No, I think you nailed it.
Great. Okay. Right. So trust in the nonprofit sector, trust in charities, which ethics and trust then become a definitive reciprocal relation. Think about the personal relationships you have and the ethics around it. Is this a good person, a just person, a nice person, not just a person who keeps the rules, but somebody that, because they are ethical and kind in their approach, that they are somebody I trust. So the more trust we have, the more ethical someone, we perceive them as ethical. The more ethical they are, the more we're likely to trust them. So these two things really go hand in hand. I wanted to take just a minute and talk about, what do we mean when we talk about ethics, particularly in the charity sector? I spend way too much time on Twitter. You can easily find me there. I am obsessed with this account on Twitter at Ethics and Bricks. I love them. Every day it's a new ethical consideration with some Lego format. It's great, right? So when we're talking about ethics, these are a couple of different definitions. There are definitions of ethics going back to centuries, and philosophers have argued over what exactly ethics means forever. But in general, I found these two definitions to be really helpful. One, a well-founded standard of right and wrong. And our video screen is right in the middle of my definition. So let me move that for a second, right? Ethics, a well-founded standards of what right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, specific virtues. Another definition here, at its simplest, ethics is a system of moral principles. They affect how people make decisions and lead their lives. It's concerned with what is good for individuals and is also good for individuals and society. If you're a part of any professional association, we'll look at this in just a second. If you're a part of any professional association, there's going to be an ethics statement associated with it. So ethics is a big topic in our sector for all of us that work with donors and all of us that work in fundraising or in any area of the charity sector. Why ethics, though? Going back to that trust issue for just a second, right? The more ethical we are, the more we're trusted, the more we're trusted, the more ethical we are. These things work together. But also by being able to take an ethical approach to what we're doing, we're providing accountability to our donors, to our communities. We're saying we're being responsible above what's required by the law, right? We're being responsible and we're accountable to it. It helps us build transparency. And as we all know, transparency in charity is something that in many cases we're required to do, but also because it's the right thing to do, to be transparent about how a donor's money is used. It helps build that public trust, and it also helps inform our responsibilities to our organization, to whom we work for, to the donor, of course, and to the beneficiary. If you're reading any of the great conversation that's going on about community-centered fundraising versus donor-centered fundraising, this is one of the principles that both are saying, right, absolutely true, that our responsibilities are equal from an ethical viewpoint to the charity we work for, to our donor, and to our beneficiary, in creating an equity amongst those, not one better than the other. I could digress on this, but bringing that ethical approach helps bring balance to all three. If you're familiar with the work of Rogare, then you may have seen this. If you're not familiar with Rogare, I'm highlighting it here for you. Full disclosure, I was a member of the Rogare Advanced Advisory Council. It is a fundraising think tank based out of the UK. It tackles a number of important issues to the sector in taking a critical thinking approach to it. One of those is this work on ethics, which you can easily download, rogare.net, fundraising-ethics. Fundraising is ethical when it balances the duty of fundraisers to ask for support on behalf of the beneficiaries with the right of the donor not to be subject to undue pressure, such that a mutually beneficial outcome is achieved and neither stakeholder is significantly harmed. So in the research and digging into what ethics means in fundraising, this is another definition of approaching it and how it balances the rights of both the beneficiary, the donor, and the organization together. I mentioned earlier, if you're part of a professional association, then you have actually signed an ethics statement. I am a former president of Association of Fundraising Professionals chapter. I'm a member of AFP and have been for decades. And every year when I renew my membership, there's a box, and we adhere to the ethical standards. I know AFP the best of all of these, but there is a methodology for whistleblowing when an AFP member violates ethics. Every single one of, now I will mention, if you were able to be in Ryan Warnicki's session yesterday, usually Ryan and I do this presentation together. He left me out on my own this time, so be kind on the reviews, but he will take great pleasure in seeing if I did not do justice to the conversation that he and I have been doing now for several months. And one of the things in putting this presentation together was we both sat down and went through every ethical standard for every association associated with the charity sector that we could. The great thing that we saw is in looking at all of these, and whether it's AFP, which I've already mentioned, CASE, APRA, which is the Professional Association for Prospect Development, GPA, Grant Professionals Association, Association of Healthcare Philanthropy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Every association that works with the nonprofit and fundraising professions has a statement of ethics, and all of them are very, very similar. Almost line by line. You can almost line them up. The interesting thing is the ones that take like 12 pages to say it, and others take like 4 paragraphs. So, everybody's got a little bit of a different approach, but they all cover essentially the main things. And many of them in their ethics statement actually also point to how we manage data. Again, AFP is the one I am most familiar with. So we highlighted this one: value the privacy of choice, or freedom of choice and interests, of all of those affected by their actions, and adhering to the spirit as well as the letter of all applicable laws and regulations. There are more ethical statements that directly relate to data, but these two definitely lift out as we have not only a legal responsibility to how we manage data because it is governed by laws, but also our professions expect us, and to our donors expect us to take a higher approach to the management of data and the approach of what they have entrusted to us by taking that higher level ethical approach. In other words, the law sets the minimum standards of behavior, while ethics will set a maximum or a higher moral standard, and essentially the right thing to do. When a donor gives us their name and gives us their information, it's the right thing to do to take good care of it and steward it, right, as they have entrusted us. They entrust us with their gifts. They are trusting us with their name, with their privacy, and with their security, which ethically, I see it as a mandate to take extra special care of what they have. So we asked a little earlier about data privacy laws, and again, I'm going to be a little US centric here. So forgive me for that. But I think in the context of contemporary data privacy law, we really have to look to GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU, and what the history and the implications of it are. If you don't, this was not directly related to GDPR, but it is a story that is told frequently. If you don't know the story of Olive Cook from the UK, look that up and Google it and know that story, because it really did drive a larger national conversation in the UK about how charities solicit and how frequent and how lists are sold and managed and traded between charities. There were a number of things that contributed to, going back to 1995, the EU Data Protection Directive, which then grew into what became GDPR. If you're not familiar with GDPR, you have been affected by it, because if you remember, a couple of years ago, we started getting all these privacy statements, and we had to check boxes, and we had to reply to emails, and we had to sign up, or we had to resubscribe to certain things that we wanted to, because all of those different organizations were suddenly being required to be GDPR compliant, which meant there were higher data protection standards. There were very strict regulations on opt-in versus opt-out. Very strict regulations on allowing people, consumers, donors, to request records on data or actually delete data out of the system. When I was trained as a CRM, word just left my head. Database admin. There we go. When I was trained as a database admin, I mean, the rule then was you never ever delete data. You always keep data, because you never know when you might need, the address they lived 10 years ago. Like, why? That's still ingrained in my mind, and actually deleting data is kind of hard for me, but there are certain restrictions and requirements that say when a donor calls, when a consumer calls and says, I want to be removed, you must delete their data and have proof of those opt-ins. The fines for non-GDPR compliance are huge and restrictive and tough, and it has informed how we look at data around the world. Another key component of GDPR is somebody in the organization must be assigned the responsibility of being the data protection officer. It is their responsibility to ensure that everybody is compliant and doing what should be done. In the United States, now this is fun, you're gonna love this. In the United States, every state has a different law. Yay! So we have this patchwork of different privacy restriction laws that cover how organizations must manage data security and data privacy. Now, I think I mentioned earlier, I'm based in Las Vegas, Nevada, so I'm right down there at the very tip end of Nevada in V, on the left-hand side, right next to California, which means Nevada and California are very, very close. We'll talk about this here in a minute, but California passed a law very similar to GDPR. Nevada, because there's so much crossover between us, went, well, if you're going to do it, then we're going to do it. So also passed a law, but put it into effect 2 months earlier. They are similar, but different. So if you're dealing with, I mean, quite literally, I can see California. If I look out my window, I'm that close to the state line. I can actually see where it is. If I am dealing with a donor who lives 15 miles from me, the laws on how I manage their data is different than how I manage a donor who lives right next door, okay? And now look at this. So this is from online, and it says last updated July 6th, 2020. So this is incredibly recent and very current and very important. And interesting, because if we look at this one, you'll actually see up there up near Maine in the upper right-hand corner, the very top one, VT, Vermont, light green. Vermont has a law that was a data privacy law that was passed in 2018. Go back, you notice this one, Vermont is listed in gray, so there's none. In other words, the laws in the US are changing so fast and they're so different from state to state that it's tough to stay on top of what is the law and what isn't. Now, how does that affect us? So let's look at CCPA, or the California Consumer Protection Act. So this one went into effect, as I said, I think it was January of 2019. It was after Nevada's went into effect. Very clearly states, CCPA very clearly states that it does not apply to nonprofits. Yay, we're off the hook. And how many of our vendors are, as businesses, are located in California, for those of us working in the United States, right? How many of our vendors? Many. In fact, one of the largest providers of nonprofit services is actually, their headquarters are located in San Francisco, in California, which means that CCPA applies to them. So it doesn't apply to us, but it will affect us in how we work with our vendors and what they require of us to enact in security protocols and so forth. CCPA gets very close to GDPR, but not quite. It does allow it does call for a right to access data, a right for a consumer to delete data, to know how their data is collected and what it's used for, and a right to opt out. You noticed how many times now, whenever you go to a website, it asks for cookies? A lot of those are because it's being CCPA compliant. Remember, we didn't used to have that pop-up and you had to choose whether or not to accept cookies. That's one thing that's causing that, is being CCPA compliant. And of course, everybody's scrambling to be CCPA compliant. And what does that mean? If you're a charity who also has an earned income side, how does that affect it? If you have, like for performing arts, if you're buying a ticket, that's a consumer, but right. So this really becomes staggering in trying to deal with it. What is happening in the United States, and I have to say, I did promise Samantha that there would be a Lego RBG, and there she is at the bottom. So it's just a little, right. In what's happening, that. Of course, a little, respect there. What's happening in the United States is that federal legislation is coming. There are several listed here. There are actually, I think, 3 more that aren't on this list. There are different bills and legislation processing through the House now that are very, very likely one of these will pass soon. And many of these are very close to, if not exact copies or very close copies of GDPR. So those of us working in the United States need to be prepared for federal legislation that will apply to all. At the moment, we're dealing with this patchwork of data privacy laws. So it is very likely coming, and very likely coming soon. So preparing now, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second. I'm getting to it, right? We're going to talk about that in just a second, of starting to prepare for it now becomes a critical approach. Samantha, I see you. Give me one more point here. Let's not panic, but we do need to watch this very carefully. And I'm presenting a fact here. It is from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It does name the vendor by name. There are now 5 class action lawsuits about the security breach. Trust me when I say that this is being watched very closely and very attentively by everyone in the charity sector, because it's going to inform all of us, and it's going to inform that federal legislation as well. So I feel questions coming on.
You are correct. The first one is from Sharon, and I think this is a question that a lot of us are curious about, is what does accepting cookies actually do?
I am not that guy. I'm sorry. It's a good question. I know like this much about it. Like accepting the cookie means that the company can say that your IP address did visit their website, but how it relates to security and all of that, I won't mention that again, because I don't know how to answer that question, and I apologize for that.
In terms of a marketing lens, when you leave cookies as well, you are opening yourself up to retargeting. So for advertising, if you are ever curious as to why you looked at a website 2 weeks ago and then all of a sudden it pops up on your Google or on your Facebook, it's because you've left a cookie on that site. And so your IP is retargeted for the product or the service that you were looking at. As a general marketing sense, that's the only 2 bits I got. I can also look up some resources for you and send it along afterwards.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Otherwise, when you accept cookies, you eat them.
Hey, snacks. So we need snacks now.
It's a snack time. So the second question is from Edna. What is the name of the fundraising book that has influenced you? You mentioned it at the start of your presentation.
I could roll over and grab it off my bookcase. Samantha, I'll see if I can kick you over a link to put in the chat box. Harold Seymour, Seymour, and it's called Designs for Fundraising. And I say it that way because he spelled it as 2 words. It is, you won't find a new copy, obviously, because it was printed in 1967, but there are copies running around. I read it every year. I encourage everybody to read it. It is one of the seminal books in fundraising, and really lays out some of the principles. So Harold J. was his nickname, Seymour, Designs for Fundraising. There it is. Somebody posted it in the chat. Thank you.
And we have one more question from Laura. How do these
Yep.
laws interact with the state-based registration for charitable solicitation?
Laura, I was literally thinking as I was talking, mention it. And as I was talking, I went, okay, we got a lot to cover, move on. I'm glad you brought it up because it's true, because every state has different, in the United States, every state has different registration and disclosure requirements. So again, California, Nevada, Utah, that whole corner of that map, I get it wrong, but Nevada is a disclosure requirement. In other words, in order to solicit charitable funds in Nevada, you must register with the Secretary of State, and you must disclose on your solicitations that you are registered in the state. Utah does not. I might have gotten that wrong. It might be Arizona that does not, but it's one of them. One of them right next door to us does not require disclosure. So if you solicit outside of the state in which you are registered as a charity, you've got to be really careful. But that's separate from the data privacy. So we've got this registration requirement over here that we got to pay attention to, because there is not a national registry. And we've got the data security things over here too, because trust me, I'm sorry to be all the sky is falling, but that's what's gonna happen at some point. Is somebody is gonna like solicit in a state and not disclose it, and then somebody who is paying attention to laws is gonna go, you didn't disclose it, and it's gonna light it up, and right, we're all gonna be in the midst of this. So look, I know I keep saying like scary things and like we got to pay attention to this, but it's good. We're gonna be good if we take some specific steps now. Samantha, any other questions before we?
Yep. We've got another one that's just come in from Christina. So we have 3 very different programs who work separately and actually are branded separately. Can you discuss the gray area of how to fundraise for general funds on a web page that is specific to one program? Is there an exception from donors that are that the money is then restricted? We haven't found an easy way to talk about everything we do at once, unfortunately.
I think that's a whole, not just a whole webinar session. I think that's a whole conference. I mean, that's like a, I mean, bravo, like big, huge question. It's something I'd need to drill into and I don't know that it necessarily ties directly to data privacy. And Samantha, I'd actually defer to you in what a lot of folks do is they'll do a different giving page, right, for each different program. And so you kind of direct those donors to those different pages, different landing pages that are tied on the back end to your general ledger, right? And they can contribute there, et cetera. But even if we're talking about disclosure and those kinds of things, it still has to be posted there, and all of those same privacy and disclosure rules apply in the different pages. But that's also one, like my contact info is at the end of this. Feel free to reach out to me or to Samantha, and we'll be happy to dig into that a little further too, with a little more specificity. So one of our questions early on was about Canadian privacy laws. I'm going to fully acknowledge that I don't know Canadian privacy laws as well as I know United States. And again, in the United States, we also have things like CAN-SPAM and the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, TCPA. Same thing in Canada. I know that one of the laws does not generally apply to nonprofits as I interpreted it, and Canadian experts, please correct me if I'm wrong. Right, again, it's the same kind of thing. These laws say they don't apply to nonprofits, but it's going to trickle over to us. I was working in telephone fundraising when the National Do Not Call list came online, and everybody could sign up and be on a Do Not Call list. And we're calling our donors, and our donors are saying, "Hey, I'm on the Do Not Call list. You can't call me." And we're like, "Yeah, well, it doesn't apply to nonprofits." The donors are like, I don't care that it doesn't apply to nonprofits. I'm on the do not call me, do not, right? So are we going to put ourselves as fundraisers as being the ones that have to counter those arguments and so forth? So again, how these laws that don't generally apply to nonprofits do affect us. And then I don't know how you all, we call ours CAN-SPAM. Is it, I don't know if it's CASL or CASL or how you refer to it, but covering opt-in for non-solicitation emails and those kinds of things. As always, whether you're in the United States or the EU or the UK or Canada, consult your legal counsel. They are the best ones to tell you how you should interpret these. And this leads us to data and governance, because it really is starting to bring data and management and security and privacy to the level of the boardroom. That if protecting an asset and adhering to the law, right, this then raises to the level of our boards of directors need to take and own some responsibility here, that it's not just something the database admin does or the person who does give entry does, but now data privacy, data security, and the legal ramifications of how we manage and approach data do rise to that level of governance. What do we need in our database? What is it used for? Can it be used elsewhere? Updating agreements to ensure institutional security as it relates to data. If your board is driving the decision to change your event platform or your peer-to-peer, whatever it may be, right? If that is part of a board decision and requires governance, then it raises to their level of, as governance, they become responsible for how those assets are managed. And reviewing information requests strongly and carefully. And when people ask us for information or bring it to us, how we review it and how we address it appropriately. Just some simple basic data security practices can really help how we approach this and how we look at data security at a granular level. Things like separate passwords for every employee or every volunteer. Do you have a platform that you use that you log into? It's a web-based platform, and you log in and everybody's got the same login and password. We need to move away from that and into everybody having their secure own login and password, so that if somebody logs in and does something, we know who it was, or we can keep it private and keep it secure and track who's in the system. I just got an email from a system that I was a user in several years ago. I'm like, guys, you really need to remove me from, I'm not a user, like take me out of it. Fortunately, my password had expired and it was all good. It just, you might want to delete me as a user and just leave me as a record. We already talked about this, sharing donor, volunteer, employee information securely, not by email, making sure antivirus software is up to date, not sharing password. This happens all the time. Hey, yeah, log in. Here's my login and password, which is sent by email or via text, and somebody can, right? Post-it notes. Post-it notes are one of the biggest security breaches. And how often do we see it, right? My login and password is you're written on a Post-it note. So all of these simple things can help us keep some minimum security that go a long way. And being very, very careful on public Wi-Fi, especially now that so many of us are working remotely, taking that extra level of caution in being on public Wi-Fi and remoting in versus I'm just going to connect on a Wi-Fi, especially if it's a public Wi-Fi like in an airport or a coffee shop or a restaurant or one of those. Some of the advanced security practices we can look at: written policy and procedures. And I can't stress this enough, just how important having written policy and procedures in place that govern how we use data, who has access to it, what security protocols that we're taking, a donor stewardship, whatever that may be, especially a gift and data entry policy and procedure so that everybody knows how things are entered. One of the biggest things you see, right? We get a bunch of checks in and we enter them, and then where do the checks go? Do we photocopy the check? Does it sit in a lockbox? Does it sit in a file? Like, just paying attention to that whole system through the whole through line from the minute the check arrives in the door, the gift comes in online, and what that whole system is and how the data is protected through that whole system. Does everybody in the organization know, and any of us that have ever had to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, when we've started to work for a new company, right? Does everybody in the organization know that they may have access to private and secure information? And is that included in our HR onboarding? Like when you sign the document that says, I got my key, I got my key card, I know where my office is, you assign me this computer, right? Are we also signing as part of HR that, yeah, I know I'm going to be accessing private data, and I am bound, as long as I'm an employee, to keep that confidential and secure, and what those protocols are. These are more advanced and they take time, but again, being the champion of that and starting that process now versus once a law passes and we have to retroactively do it, just taking simple steps. Again, it's also a way of conveying trust to our donors and our constituencies that we're taking care of them. So this is why Lego plays so strongly in this, and why, again, my buddy Ryan and I, why this sort of became the thing. This is a stock picture that I got from Unsplash, but this was me at 5 years old. This literally, like, take the big thing of Lego and dump it out on the floor, and then sort it and build something. And my parents would always say, I kept it in this big blue plastic tub, which I still have. And my parents would always say, just about the time they'd lay down to take a nap, I would pull out that big plastic tub and start rattling through it and wake them up. I was a precocious child. But this is it, right? So you dump out all this Lego and then you start to build something from it. So that's where we got the metaphor about using Lego to talk about data, because it's a big mess. And then as we pay attention to it, it starts to sort and get clean. And it's also the most fun and clever and creative toy in the world. So that's my take on it, right? But we use it as a metaphor in talking about prospect development and how that relates to data and what this means. And I know there's some folks on the call that are true prospect development professionals. I am prospect development adjacent, I will say, but data plays directly into how we manage and how we work with our donors. Prospect development is as APRA, the Professional Association for Prospect Research, defines it, the strategic arm of an organization's fundraising operation focusing on prospect pools and pipelines, collaborating with gift officers and development leaders to ensure fundraising efforts are focused on working, and this is exquisite and I love it, with the right donors for the right gifts at the right times, and in many cases with the right initiatives. That goes to the question that we had earlier. This is all part of how we as fundraisers and the profession manage and deal with and work with our donors and prospective donors. And all of this, in my mind, relates directly to data and management. So we all know, hopefully, the donor life cycle, right? Identification, qualification, cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship, and then it repeats. Prospect development applies to all areas, right? In managing data, in dealing with the prospects and the donors, all of that applies at every step of the game, but it's really concentrated in kind of these first three areas, especially as it relates to data and security, the identification, the qualification, and the cultivation of our donor prospect pools and who our donors are. And that's really where the data security focus and the ethical approach to data comes in play, as we, and whether you're fortunate to work with a separate prospect development team, or you, the direct fundraiser, or you, the database admin, are responsible for that process yourself, right? A smaller shop. Either way, those areas where we are figuring out who our donors are and making sure that the right folks to ask and how much we're going to ask them for and what are the steps leading up to in cultivating that ask and appropriate, all of that really ties to that connection economy, how we relate to our donors and how these security protocols and the ethical approach to them impact what that relationship is going to be like. So ethical considerations in how we look at that prospect development process, things like, and I tend to lean a little towards direct mail and direct response, and you get this all the time. If you're ever doing any acquisition and you either purchase or rent a list or whatever, your acquisition approach is, how did you get my name? Hey, we live in a world where it's time to be honest. We rented a list, we bought a list, it was given to us by this, you were just in our database and I don't know why, but you were there, right? Answering that question to donors of how did you get my name honestly and directly. For major gifts, in using the profile and identification and qualification. If you build a whole profile on a donor before you go to the ask, what their company is and their kids and all of that information, right? And you build that profile and you're sitting across from that donor and they say, I want to see everything you have on me. And I've had this happen. Ryan and I both have had it happen. I think many major gift officers have gone in for an ask and the donor has said, hey, how do you know to ask me for that amount? What led you to ask me for that, right? I want to see the information that you have on it. This was a question that got posed not too long ago on Twitter. Again, too much time on Twitter, right? That got posed not too long ago on, would you share that information with the donor? Absolutely. If you have information on a donor that you wouldn't want them to know that you have, why do you have it? What could be on a profile that you wouldn't want to share with them? So again, thinking ethically on how our donors may respond to our prospect development approaches, right? And this reference to the mid and low renewals. Low-end donors, mid-level donors make me nuts. People don't walk around going, hey, I'm a low-end donor, right? We need better names here. We'll get there. One of these days. I've heard grassroots, I've heard get to know me gifts, right? But we need a better name than low-end donors. Prospect development isn't just the realm of major gifts though. How we research and look at donors at all levels and what we know about them becomes information that they can then ask for that is guided by security. It helps us focus that approach rather than taking that kind of scattered approach to it. And how we ethically approach the data that we have on every donor at every level becomes a key consideration in looking at the responsibility that we have. And plus, of course, as we've already seen with the laws, the opt-in and opt-out, donors having the right to say, I don't want to hear from you anymore. Even if they've been a donor before, we have to honor that and take protocols. The hard truths that we need to face, that personal data isn't private. As much as we like to think it is, it just isn't. Every time you sign up for something, every time you use a credit card, every time you use an ATM card, our personal data is out there. It gets used and can be bought and sold. And it is not. If we're on social media, your personal information is out there. Our organizations really do need to treat and think about data and approach data as managing it like the treasure and the asset it is. It is, in my mind, the single greatest asset that a nonprofit can possess. Again, back to ethics, if a prospect asks you about what data, like I also kind of go, okay, if somebody asks me what data I have on them, what did I say or what did I do in that relationship that made them think to ask that? And I might have taken a wrong step somewhere. So I just need to, like rushing the ask or something like that. And specifically when we're talking about data appends, if we're adding emails, if we're adding addresses or phone numbers or anything that we append to the data, following the rules for it. For those of us in the US that have a little more access to public data than Canada or the EU do, if you're looking at a wealth screening, knowing that a wealth screening is one tool, it's not the tool, but is one that helps us guide where the conversation can go. Again, keeping everything, part of data is part of being donor-centered, right? And if you look at Penelope Burke, the book, Donor-Centered Fundraising, prompt and meaningful acknowledgement, having a gift that they made assigned to a program that is narrower in scope than the mission, and receiving a report, especially the prompt and meaningful acknowledgement and the receiving the report, those are directly related to data and how we manage it. So data management does leap not only to the level of governance, but also to being to the level of governance, but to being donor-centered and being conscious of the changing landscape that we're in that is just evolving everywhere. Whatever part of the world that we're in, the approach to data and how we manage it is evolving quickly, and identifying how these policies affect us and our organization becomes a leadership step. So just some brief recommendations: a clear and precise gift acceptance policy, stakeholder buy-in, a data usage manual, whistleblower policy, and begin now to have a data protection person in place, making data a priority and on par with goals. I think the single biggest thing that we can do as fundraisers and as database admins in whatever our role is begin to take that step of leadership to say, hey, data is important, we want to manage it carefully, and really drive that conversation internally, because donors are data. And what they're asking us is, call me by my true names. so I can wake up and the door of my heart could be left open, the door of compassion. This is what we're here for as fundraisers, as charity people, is reaching out to people and accessing their values and bringing about the change that they want to see in the world. And from where I sit, we can't do that unless we get their names right and know who they are and promise that we're going to take care of that information for them. So thank you for spending a lunch hour talking about data with me. We are running a data survey in partnership with Donor Search. If you get a chance and are interested and can, would love your help. We're trying to get a feel for how the world is managing data privacy and security. Feel free to reach out to me. Samantha, I'll turn it over to you for any winding up questions.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, those were the building blocks to good data management for all nonprofits, so I appreciate that. I had to get that pun in. I wouldn't be me if I didn't try. I have questions from Alana coming in. So the first one is just to redirect back to the beginning. What was the name of the person in England to Google? Was his name Oliver Cook?
Olive.
Olive.
Yeah, you just want to look up that story. Yep.
Perfect. And then the second question.
I'm confirming that as we speak. I'm listening.
The second question then mentions, so we're not supposed to email donor data lists, but if you have to ask fundraisers to call or solicit for you, what are your suggestions? To print everything? Some people would prefer everything online. So how would you combat that kind of scenario?
Yeah, great question. And you're talking about volunteer fundraisers, I imagine, or folks outside of your office doing it. This bit gets really tricky. The preference would be to set up a call bank internally, right? And do it internally if you can. That is the most secure. Excuse me. I am extremely conservative in these approaches. So understand that some of my answers I know are very conservative and sometimes not doable. If you have to print, you know what? I'm going to tell you that I'm not going to say it. I'm going to tell you to ask your legal counsel or to talk about it with your board. I mean, you could give them a list they could take, but then they have to be sure to return the list. The best approach, if you want to be truly secure, is to try to do it as much as you can in-house. This is also hard when we're working remote, and how often I'm logged into my system, I'm logged in appropriately, but I'm going to write down that phone number on a Post-it note. Like, just got to be conscious of these potential security breaches. I will applaud your thinking of that and encourage you to talk it over with your leadership of how best should we approach it.
I think this question has been playing on a lot of people's minds after the Blackbaud scandal, but what is the first thing you should do if there has been a data breach at your organization?
Tell the donor. Well, okay, the first thing you should do is make sure your leadership knows, your CEO and executive leadership and your board of directors, right? And determine the amount of exposure that you may have and the potential security breach that you may have, and work with your vendor or whomever it is or even if it's just yourself, to find out what the extent of the breach is, number one, right? So first, that, determine what it is and find out. Then secondly, communicate as quickly and as accurately as you can with anybody affected, and appropriately say the truest thing that you can. We were breached, your data was hacked, to the best of our knowledge there has been, your data is not in jeopardy, or whatever the truest thing can be. Because honestly, you want to get it out there sooner rather than later, because if they find out that you knew about it and you didn't communicate it until months later, that's when lawsuits happen.
Great advice. This last question, I think we have time for maybe one more after this, but this one's from Laura. Is there any website we can go to get an understanding of the different data protection laws and email solicitation laws in the US?
I wish I had one off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Laura. I literally Google United States data privacy laws, and whatever that first site is that comes up. There's a couple of them. There's a couple of clearinghouses on those that will pop up. A number of fundraising and nonprofit consultants are keeping track of this well. There's a few consulting firms that are also tracking it. A quick search will bring it up for you, I promise.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Terrific session, as Helen says, and I'd like to mirror that. It was amazing having you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It was really informative. And for whether, even if you're a CRM like us, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a for-profit, if you're a B Corp, regardless of who you are, I think data ethics and privacy laws are something that everybody needs to be on top of no matter what, especially as we're becoming a more digital environment. This isn't going to change.
Exactly. Yep.
So I'm going to pop my last screen up. There we
Oh,
are.
I think I have to stop doing that there. Now it's yours.
Oh,
Sorry.
thank you so much. All right, just a reminder, if you liked what we learned, we want to hear about it. There will be a 3-question survey at the end of this presentation. It's anonymous, of course, and we would love it if you could share your thoughts about the session. I'm sure Clay would also like to hear from you. If you want, you can, I'm assuming, reach out over LinkedIn and continue the conversation.
Please. Yep.
Otherwise, take it over to our virtual networking space in the Keela community. Mel's popped the link in the chat for us there, or Ness, and I want to thank everybody so much again for joining us. That concedes day 2 of our 5-day conference. Thank you so much for attending, and I will let Clay say a final goodbye.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Be here for Julia tomorrow. Amazing, good friend, amazing. This is a life-changing session, so do that.
All right, well, have a great day, everyone. Enjoy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye now.